Anyone still outside? Let's go.
사실의 그 길 주시면서 그라는 시는데 양파리 성례 신금의 때우하리 로그 남다 신라주하쇼 이랑그 아타만다 감리야자야 상계 최남 서기 조남라 양실바드 다니 겹수치 야기 진행 기배선남기 올라근실 성계 루파쇼 상계 주랑석기 적남라 전주가르 다니 겹수치 야기 진행 기배선남기 올라근실 성계 루파쇼 상계 주랑석이 적남라 전주가르 다니 겹수치 야기 진행 기배선남기 올라근실 성계 루파쇼
So find a comfortable meditation posture. And right away begin to ground your energies, feeling contact with what appears to your senses as earth element. Try right from the beginning to be aware precisely that what you're experiencing as a body is coming to you only as appearances to the senses. Try from the beginning to let go of habitual conceptualizations of my legs, my arms, so on, and just be in what is arising without thinking about it further. Let your awareness of tactile sensations, however they arise, continue. At the center, what appears as a core. What appears as upper limbs. What appears as what they used to call a face. What does it actually feel like though? A ping here, a tightening there, a loosening there. You don't even need to use words. Amidst this strange array of sensations, you might start to notice one flow, has a rhythm to it. A movement that seems to pass out of and then into that which you used to call your body. Even that, just let it be a sensation. But watch those sensations very carefully. Is there even a flow to them? Don't take it for granted. And try to notice where the sense of awareness seems located in relation to that of which you are aware. Practically, can you differentiate them? As though there is a watcher and that which is watched. Do you have that experience? Even once dropping off so many other labels. Does the awareness seem broader than that which is watched? Or does it seem like a small point looking outward? Is it possible to play with the breadth of your awareness? Try it. Taking in the whole field of tactile sensations. And somewhere at the core of this space, find a stillness that never moves. Can you take refuge there? Not simply for being still, but for being a fathomless ground. A source from which the very ideas, space, change, duration, mind, action, could ever arise in the first place. Do ideas have a beginning? If sentient being is just an idea, where does it exist? Can you see all sentient beings in your heart? And know that your heart is not you anymore. And that all sentient beings are not separate from that infinite space, that infinite possibility that embraces them all. The stories, the ideas with which the stories of lifetimes are told, do they belong to anyone? Could you see the storyline of anyone else's life and know it to be your own? If you let go of I, how easily can you inhabit everyone? Just at the moment, it almost becomes too much to bear. Call upon the one you believe is the embodiment of this kind of love. Let that being come to you as an outer form, resting in the space in front of you. The embodiment of my love. Blazing in white light. Seated upon discs of the sun and moon. In a vast flower. The one who looks down at you with love. The kind of love you have just glimpsed. That does not see anyone as self or other. Simply stories. Simply appearances. Worthy of love. if you admire that knowledge, that view, let this be your frustration. If you could look into the eyes of such love directly, what would you want to give? And the offering of your very self take form. If you dare, make supplication and ask this love to come within the innermost channels, the innermost passageways of your being, to break open anything that stops you from expanding that far. From loving that much. Anything that stops you from experiencing all of reality now. Anything that stops you serving that reality with every breath, every vibration that you are. If you dare, make supplication to this embodiment in love. To come to the crown of your head and transform you. Allow white shining nectar to pour from the divine presence upon your crown and fill your entire being. Purifying every trace of what you have clung to as me from time without beginning. And then gradually from the tips of what you called your feet up to the crown of what you called your head, filling you with a light that can shine to the ends of the universe. Relax our attention to this. just pull your body and your crown directly to your own heart. And dare to ask what it is you want most now that you've given away your very self. See that the passageway is open. The channel is clear for the Lord to enter you and reside forever within your heart. And begin to relax and open your awareness, noticing the sensations that arise in this body, suffused with light. Let the appearances of an outer room start to seep in. Try to taste insofar as you have changed, how your environment has changed. Oh, thank you all for entering such a profound space together. I encourage you to take time in your practice to let things unfold, to let things ripen. Sometimes it's too easy to think we have to keep doing, think we have to keep we learn practices, we become accustomed to them, embody them. As I said the first day, it's an amazing, wonderful step to start to be creative with even a liturgy or a sequence and make it your own, speak it from your heart. And then sometimes, at least in my own experience, sometimes even that doesn't work. Like sometimes you just, something is calling to you from your heart, from your practice, to say, not today. Let go of what you thought you were going to do in your practice. And as long as the patterns are there, because it's about seeds, right? You've been planting the seeds of your practice. And it's that very consistency that gives you the space in which releasing what you thought you had to do doesn't mean you won't practice. It means you go deeper. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is something very, I can only say that because of the meditation we just had, right? Because you know what I'm referring to. I'm not talking about setting something aside. I'm talking about letting the momentum of the consistency and the discipline and the structure that you've set for yourself open into the place it was meant to lead to. And sometimes that place it was meant to lead to won't look like the way you learned the practice, but the way you learn the practice is what gets you there. And there's something about that balance that I feel like all my teachers have instilled in me in one way or another. From dance to yoga to meditation to the highest practices of Dharma. I'm not separating any of those things, by the way. All layered. So the particular thread, the particular idea that I had not planned this morning, but that came is this space where if you can taste what mental images mean, and we haven't talked as much about mental images this time around, but once you're tasting idea, just the unchanging thing that's an idea, if this is what labels are made of, and then you're trying to watch what is this changing stream that one calls ascension being, that one calls continuity of karmic propensities, karmic ripenings, karmic actions. And you can, and this is a leap because we haven't been going here step by step, but I think all of you are ready to understand this very well, better than I. When you know that stream, or you've been meditating really deeply on what is that stream of causation that is merely labeled I, me, and you can somehow taste the, and now I really mean emptiness of that label. Labels are not things. Labels are not realities. Labels are, I mean, if you even just break up the word, if you break up the sound, you realize there's nothing there in a label. And somehow that label can float away, and yet you can't find anything else. It's a stream, label, 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 all the way down. And we're so used to thinking from an idea of center out. that I think even the way we try to think through these questions of self and other, projection and projected upon, coming from me, coming from you, we get stuck in it because we haven't yet gone deep enough in letting go of what we even think is the locus of our own labeling process. And so I think there are certain things that can be resolved almost, if temporarily, because then we come back to our ordinary way of functioning. But in meditation, when you can realize the ephemerality of that label of I, and dwell in a space, as we started to taste, where there's nothing here. Physicality is mere arising of sensations. Karma is these mere, and that's why I like the word traces for samskara. It's just these, like, as the image arises in Mahamudra lineage, the tracks of a bird in the sky. Have you ever seen the tracks of a bird in the sky? If we could let our karma be that ephemeral. Karma will not be that ephemeral if we don't realize it to be. That's the key. It's like karma is concretely real and comes at us as intractably as we know, precisely because we haven't gotten that deep. But going that deep, you can start to taste a place where karma could dissolve. Not that it does right away by any means. That's why realization has to be really deep and really stable to start to touch the ground, how do I even speak of these things? The beginningless depths of accumulation of causes that haven't yet come to result, and yet only by seeing the ephemerality of those causes themselves does a new cause begin to be planted that will stop it from ripening. You know, you've heard it, it's the theory of purification. But what can that actually feel like when you see that the track is no more than the tracks of a bird in the sky? Because you're not holding on to the person you thought was there who held the karma. And then likewise, when your heart is that open, and you're releasing self-grasping that much, you start to see that everyone else is just the same. And there is no real space, real place holding us apart. Understanding prana is, I find, very helpful for this. If we could step back enough just in this room and drop all the labels of names and identities and histories, people, and just experience the whole room as vibrations, where does one person's vibration start and another person's stop? Even if we go all the way to the indestructible drops at the center of each of our hearts, there are wavelengths, extremely subtle prana, pouring out of those drops. And they are interacting. And somewhere in there, I believe, is the answer to how there's a shared world that manifests as coarse physical matter, manifests as the experienced elements, hardness, flexibility, heat, intense vibration, and then the lighter vibration of wind itself. So to jump and start to think, but you see, the more open your heart is, the more this kind of space opens to be able to think this way, to experience this way. that there is, I'm not the one to say it, but there's also, I'll use the language like possibility. There is the possibility of a ground where extremely subtle vibrations and consciousness is creating a shared world we can appear to walk around in. And each of us will see from the layered over perspective that's due to the coarser and coarser winds that are riding on the winds of karma, as they call it, winds of those habituations. So we end up having our individual projections of the way the world looks to me and the way the world appears to look to you. And then we feel like we can't penetrate how the world looks to somebody else because we can't get inside their indestructible drop. We can't get inside their channels. We can't get inside their perspective. But by dropping down to that ground, deeper and deeper in meditation, we gain the possibility of a perspective from which everybody's arising. And then karmic interactions make sense. But there is no single locus. There is no single center that is the right one. As long as they seem to be individual centers. But the omniscient perspective isn't located in any one of them. Is located beyond all of them, and therefore, as we read, or I read to you yesterday, Jetsun Kappa can speak of the holy gaze or the perspective of the Buddha, who sees how all of these, think of it as karmic, magnetized spirals. Everybody's karmic propensities are the magnet that hold their world, that spin their world around them to look at a certain way. Get the analogy. But there could be a perspective that sees the way each of those spinnings is producing the way its world looks. But that perspective doesn't fall into any of them, and yet can see them as an arising. And that would be one way of establishing conventional reality. There are places where Jetsun Kappa actually says it is the Buddha who establishes conventional reality. Because it is the totally valid perception that sees that something is arising in a way that makes sense and functions for each of these beings. But to return to that inseparability of trying to think that through at the depths of wisdom and to see that that is compassion. Because if one could look even for a moment upon the whole of space and time, I can't even use the word reality at this point, but all the beings there ever are and will be, trying to imagine it from that kind of perspective. How could the heart just not open into, there's nothing else worth doing but caring for every mind stream that thinks it's a mind stream, until it doesn't think it's a mind stream anymore because it's also gazing from that perspective. The word I'm thinking of, the Tibetan word that I say when I say holy gaze, is sikpa, as in tenrei sik. It's the honorific for to look, to see. So the tenrei sik, the gaze of the holy eyes. maybe I better stop there. Are you ready to keep going? So then in that perspective, why does it matter so much to figure out these details, or at least contemplate these details, of all the different levels of illusion? And what would be a more or less accurate way of understanding the illusion? You know, if we're dealing with illusion anyway, almost, why does it matter so much to understand the illusion in exactly an accurate way? Because the implication from these arguments is that the mind-only school position that is being set as the foil in the debates has thought a lot about illusion but doesn't quite understand it yet. That's the implication, is, oh, they're trying to say the world is illusory, but they don't understand the illusion quite well enough yet. And so for us then, why does it matter so much that we keep going deeper in our own perception of the illusion, so that no part of our perception or what we hold to, because we'll always end up holding to a view, as long as we're not Arya Bodhisattvas, or even very, very high level Arya Bodhisattvas, while we're in the J-top, in the aftermath, in the engaging with the deceptive world mode, we will be holding to our views at some level, because the seeds for seeing anything that appears as having some reality, even if we don't believe it, will arise. So that's why I'm extending that, even, obviously, until we see emptiness directly, everything that arises will appear to be real, and we'll hold it to be real, even if we have an accurate understanding of the middle way view. But even after seeing emptiness directly, as long as one's engaging with deceptive reality, again, there's still that appearance of things as real until the eighth bodhisattva level. So the practice then becomes noticing constantly what kind of view we hold and how that's informing our actions. And being sensitive to how the teachings we receive from our trusted teachers are always going to push us to break through the very view we think we hold, even as we follow the instruction. So that's not easy, but it's really it's very worthwhile work. So there's a piece of information I kind of avoided yesterday because I didn't want to make it more difficult, but I feel like I have to let you know this. This isn't bad news, don't worry. Is that the entire section within the explication of the 6th chapter of Master Chandrakirti's Entering the Middle Way, even that has a substructure to it, which for Jethakapa ends up being a matter of each of the 4 possibilities in what's known as the Tiptra lemma, or the 4 possibilities in Arya Nagarjuna's writings, which as soon as I say it will be familiar. So you say things are not born from themselves, things are not born from something other, they're not born from both self and other, and they're not born from neither. Now, in the structure of the book, as I said, 10 bodhisattva levels, more than half the book is on the 6th. Within the 6th, there's a beautiful introduction that Jethakapa gives, and then the refutation of these 4 possibilities. The refutation of being born from self is of significant length. I haven't touched it at all in this particular teaching. It mostly ends up being a debate between the Svatantric and the Prasangika school. But then the refutation of being born from another takes up most of chapter 6. So again, it's like if you see the whole book as a sandwich, the big, giant meat in the center is the refutation of being born from other, because that's the one we think happens, right? Whenever, has anybody had that experience? If you listen to those four and you go, well, of course things are born from other things. And so the hardest part is to realize what we instinctively hold to when we think of one thing and another thing. And the way we think each of those would exist in themselves. So the main place that Geshe Michael teaches on this is actually in the ACI Course 12, Master Shantideva, going through those four refutations. And in particular, and this was groundbreaking for me to realize, or to hear him explain it this way, that you'll only get the fact that things don't come from other things if you realize that the other thing it could come from would be a thing that wasn't a projection force on you by your karma. Right? So that if you then are able to add that distinction of the thing to be refuted upon the thing it comes from and the thing it turns into, then it makes sense that you're saying nothing can come from another thing that wasn't in turn merely labeled by your mind based upon your karmic propensities. So in my own work in reading Jetsun Kappa's book, I was constantly thinking through how could one apply that particular special teaching from Geshe Michael at every step of the game that Jetsun Kappa is working through, and how does it continue to shed light on the distinctions that Jetsun Kappa is making. And a lot of what I've been sharing with you are the places where I found myself being surprised by where I thought I stood in the debate, and realizing that these debates with the mind-only school were constantly refining my own view. And as I've already insisted, recognizing that all the things that Jetsun Kappa ultimately rejects about the mind-only school are not the karmic parts. They're the way they hold karma to exist, or the way they hold the mind to exist. And so in this section on cataracts, which I kind of rushed through yesterday, it leads into a long discussion of how karmic potentials, and this is yet another word for karmic seeds, potentials, nuva, which literally means the capacity to do something, how they can't exist really in the past, they can't give rise to a result really in the present, and they can't give rise really to a result in the future either. But you have to hold that world really, or three characteristics of their own, at every step of the game, or it's going to sound like he's denying karmic potentials, but he's not doing that. So again, if you can bear with me, I need to get into the details in order not to make any mistakes, I hope, but also somehow get the import of the argument across to you. So to review a little bit, the situation is that of somebody who has an eye disease or cataracts, and is having the appearance of hairs or other fuzzy apparitions passing in front of the eyes. And the mind-only school debater takes this as a parallel example to the dream, saying if it's possible for a mind to perceive objects that aren't really there, then this proves that consciousness always, like it's the extrapolation from the extreme case of the dream or the extreme case of the cataracts to, well, consciousness is always producing all of its objects and nothing's out there. And I said that then that creates the problem if you say that that's a real consciousness, and you have to get the taste that real would mean what that consciousness produces is the truth. So if you're saying there's a consciousness with nothing outside, then whatever that consciousness produces is the truth. And how different is that from our middle way view, where you can say, this person due to their karma is projecting this upon a basis, this person due to their karma is projecting this upon a basis, but neither one is ultimately real. As opposed to this mind-only school where every person's projection from consciousness alone, sem-tam, consciousness alone, mind only, is producing reality. And then those become mutually contradictory realities that will butt up against each other. And you have two choices. Either everybody's in their bubble, producing their own world, and basically there's no way they can agree or disagree because, well, my reality is real and my reality is real, and consciousness is established through its own nature. So what it produces has to be mutually contradictory. And that's where the middle way school will say, sorry, that's not going to work because that will break the laws of logic eventually. Not to mention what I think maybe I've suggested in conversations, it really makes bodhicitta difficult. If you have these if you take it all the way to the mind-only school extreme, the potential extreme of bubbles that can't actually interact. But notice, as I say, that the potential extreme, and that's the extreme that the prasangika consequence school debater is going to say, hey, if you take your view far enough, that's the way it's going to be. It doesn't mean that the people who held mind-only school views actually believed in solipsism, certainly not, or didn't have bodhicitta. On the contrary, the mind-only school teachings, the Yogacara teachings on bodhicitta are some of the most magnificent we have. I mean, the Abhisamaya Alankara is the work of Maitreya written in the hand of a Sangha on the qualities of the Bodhisattva levels of the Buddha. So I'm not in the least saying that mind-only school thought would be difficult for bodhicitta. I'm just saying that if you take that view all the way to its end or hold to it, it might, for any individual practitioner, lead to difficult situations. And that's what I feel here the mind-only school person is coming in to say, hey, you don't have to get stuck there because there's another way. Does that make sense? Yes. Oh yeah, when I said they don't fall into solipsism, as some of you may have heard Geshe Michael refer to a text by Dharmakirti called Proving the Existence of Other Mind Streams. And I did a little bit of work with that text. I actually tried translating it. I think I would start all over again if I worked on it now. That was maybe 7 years ago. So there's one Mongolian commentary. So it's something we need to do. We need to work on that text because it's really important. And it's Dharmakirti supposedly writing within a mind-only school view, proving deductively there has to be somebody else there because their speech and mind is a result of their what appears as their speech and mind is a result. It must be a result of their actions, just like my speech and mind must be a result. I mean, my body and speech must be a result of what's going on in my mind. As I say, I have not mastered that text, but I just want to point out it's not, again, that the mind-only school ever said there's only one sentient being or you're all alone or any of those things. But what I feel this elimination of the true thought is almost giving us permission to recognize is, yeah, but if we get stuck thinking that each of these minds projecting their worlds in any way really exists, we're going to be stuck in that absurd consequence. If it sounds like I contradicted myself 5 times in the last 5 minutes, that's good, because we have to be at that edge where we're never judging a school, we're never judging the people who held those views, but we're recognizing how if I myself went to an extreme, I'd get stuck. So again, always keep in mind the kind of identity that's being refuted. So if we're refuting birth from another, where it has to be a real other, as I said, this particular mind-only viewpoint, when they're arguing for the dreams as an analogy, the cataracts as an analogy, they would in effect do away with the focal condition as having any causal efficacy. and as we saw in the case of the blind person, would effectively reduce the governing condition of a sense faculty to a mere, and here I use a very contemporary word, a mere epiphenomenon of the ripening tendencies. So as I said, if you have this model where the only efficient cause is the chain of ripening tendencies, like I get the analogy of like a computer program where it's just tendency, 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 and that's the only thing that's causing anything. If you're thinking that way, then the very fact of faculties is just an epiphenomenon or a side effect of those ripening tendencies. And then you get in that problem of the blind man dreaming. Well, why is the faculty, or why is the damaged faculty not hindering him during the dreams? But it is in waking life, if the only difference is not even the sleep, it's just what tendencies are ripening in one place or another. And real problem there, I'm going to skip again, is dependent origination never meant single causal streams. It always means there are multiple causes and conditions going on at any single moment. And in a way, this comes back to the argument why there's not a single creator. Because it would go right back to, well, if there was a single creator of anything, even if it was karma, that would reify the creator. And there's this beautiful verse from Master Shantideva, which I believe is from the 6th chapter on patience, when he's refuting other creators other than your karma in order to say how to keep your patience when something bad happens. He says, from various conditions come the various illusions themselves, but in no case at all can a single condition have the capacity for all. And it helps us understand illusion too. And I love, of course, having been a dancer and knowing behind the scenes theater so well. When you think how many things have to come together to produce the illusion of a performance, but it applies to anything. It applies to a computer screen. How many things have to come together to produce the illusion of a computer screen that you can interact with? The illusion of a restaurant, the illusion of a subway ride, the illusion of, you realize the whole point of illusions is it looks like one thing's happening, but actually all these different things are coming together to produce the effect. And so likewise, the notion of saying it looks like one real thing is happening, but in fact, lots of different causes and conditions are coming together to produce the effect. That's one way of seeing illusion in our moment-to-moment existence. Yeah.
Could you read this line again?
Yeah, sure. From various conditions come the various illusions themselves, but in no case at all can a single condition have the capacity for all. So various conditions produce the various illusions, but in no case at all can a single condition have the capacity to produce everything. Again, that's a refutation of some single mind creating everything that ever happens. Actually, it comes as a refutation of an Ishvara kind of creator, like a non-Buddhist view of a single mind that creates the events of the world. But I'm actually, and this was just something that came to me to apply it here as well, not to say that a single mind or a single karma could produce everything, or even a single stream of karmas. And that's part of the problem that comes in about, I don't actually want to get into it now because it gets very, very technical, how to prove why a karma, why a really existing bhaktak of the past can't produce a really existing event in the present. But I will read to you one of Jitsukapa's conclusions about it, which is extremely reassuring. He's used the example of, in the world, you can say, or rather, actually, it's the opponent who says, in the world, you can say, cook up some rice porridge, or weave a cloth from this yarn, while thinking of the rice dish that is to come and the blanket that is to come. So this is an example of how we're using labels for things that don't exist yet, but it makes sense. And in Tibetan, the word for rice porridge is jetin, and the word for rice is je, which ironically is the word for result, but that's not an issue here. And so it's basically saying, cook the thing that doesn't exist yet. So if you were thinking that things could only be referred to if they actually existed, if they were real, then it wouldn't make sense, because how can you refer to the rice porridge that doesn't exist? Likewise, to bring the analogy, how could you say a karmic potential gives rise to a moment of consciousness? How can you even say that if the consciousness exists really? Then could the potential ever really be a cause for it, if even to be able to refer to it, it had to exist already? This is what I mean by middle way conundrums. But it is why refuting birth from another makes sense, because it means a real other, where one thing had to be completely fully existent, and then somehow does it go out of existence, and then another thing comes into existence. Well, if that's the case, then it couldn't have caused it, because they didn't exist at the same time. So one thing went out of existence and the next thing came into existence. There's no relationship between them. Or if it still existed when the next thing came in, then it wouldn't have caused it either, because what in the first thing could ever have changed if it really existed again? Inherently existing thing could never change, so it could never turn into anything else. Or there's one more permutation. If by the time the future thing has come into, the future thing was already somehow inherent in the first thing, and there actually are schools in Hindu thought that say that the future thing is somehow already in a nascent form in its cause, and so then it just evolves or unfolds from that, which of course from a merely labeled point of view is fine. But if you're trying to hold it as real, then you still can't say that the first thing was cause for the second thing, because the second thing already existed, so it didn't need a cause. So basically, refuting cause from another is a whole series of ways that it either falls back to refuting cause from self, or it's saying refuting something arising without a cause at all. Because you realize how these two, I think of these like cannonballs or billiard balls, that they're not going to affect each other. So the problem of saying cook up rice pudding, which doesn't exist yet, or weave a cloth from this yarn, when you can't speak of a cloth that doesn't exist, isn't a problem once you acknowledge that you can have the conception of a cloth because you've seen a cloth before, and you can have the conception of rice porridge because you've eaten it before, and you know that this particular rice, if you cook it long enough, will turn into that thing of which you have a memory. But to be aware of how much we're using the conceptions of things that we've seen before in talking about causation at all does start to point to how cause and effect are coming from mental. So that even being able to talk about cause and effect is dependent upon mental images all along the line. And then to start to see that the ripening of karma itself, where a karmic potential can give rise to a karmic effect, can't even happen in real time, as it were. Because you can never point to the moment when a karmic potential turned into a karmic effect. And that's where even the ripening of karma is empty. Because the very process is a cause and effect process. And unfortunately, and I challenge you to help me with this, please, it becomes very awkward if at that moment the only thing you're thinking of as meaning that something is empty is the fact that it's forced on you by your karma. This is what I meant yesterday, and I felt like I didn't say it well enough. If you've so embodied, as we all should, the idea that a thing, the emptiness of a thing is the fact that it lacks, not being a projection forced on us by our karma, and then you're trying to look at the emptiness of karma itself, you have to get delicate. Because if you're trying to look at the emptiness of a karmic seed existing inherently and turning into a potential inherently, if you say the emptiness of the karmic seed is the lack of the karmic seed not being a projection forced on me by my karma, then you're stuck against a wall because you don't know what emptiness is apart from speaking about karma. It's actually really scary for me to say this because it can so easily be misunderstood. But are you with me that if you've so associated an analysis of emptiness with a certain idea about karma, you might get stuck in analyzing karma itself as being empty. And so knowing that tetralemma, those four possibilities, from their sheer abstract logic impossibility, that's kind of all you have to go on once you're analyzing the emptiness of karma itself. And it's very interesting to me that when Jetson Kappa gets to analyzing the emptiness of karmic potentialities, he's going right back to Arya Nagarjuna. And there's almost not much. I watch my own mental affliction. I get bored with it because it's like, oh yeah, I knew about that if a thing is really a cause, it can't ever turn into its result because by the time the result is there, the cause has to be gone. So what I just went through. But you almost have to know that so well that it feels boring to you, if I dare say that. Because in meditation, it has to come like this, instantaneously. You know why a cause can't turn into an effect, if the cause was real. But you see why I'm saying it's almost like one has to get that mathematical about it in analyzing the emptiness of karmic potentialities. Because if you think of karmic potentialities themselves as being projections forced on you by your karma, that may be true. I think it is true. But if we only get stuck in one more label about, oh, I know what a karmic potentiality is, it's empty because it's a projection forced on me by my karma, you haven't gotten any deeper in understanding what karma is. You see what I mean? Why we can use a formula like that for probably 99% of our path. And then there's a tiny space in meditation when you have to be able to turn that analytical sword, that analytical laser on karma itself. And I almost can't talk about it without trying to meditate, because it's as subtle as our meditation this morning. How is a karmic potentiality a projection forced on you by karma? It's true that there's a seed for labeling the relationship between cause and effect in a certain way. For even having the idea of cause and effect. That's got to be a picture too. It can be a picture that always works in a certain way. Likewise, how can a moment of mind turning into another moment of mind be an interaction between two labels, if labels can't change? How can the arising of a moment of consciousness itself be a result of a karmic trace, as we discussed extensively in the 12 links? If a karmic trace can't really exist, and the moment of consciousness can't really exist, can't think of them as two billiard balls hitting each other, and yet there's an arising. How is the consciousness of a sentient being merely labeled, and yet a label is unchanging, and consciousness is a flow? Or the appearance of a flow, because the mind puts two parts together, a memory of a previous moment and a memory of the next moment, and so it appears that consciousness flows. And how can the energy of a potential that has no nature of its own still give rise to its effect without having to stay anywhere? Because the destruction of a thing is sufficient for it to bring about its cause. And because time is empty, and a thing that occurred 1,000,000 years ago can bring about a result in the present. I can't answer any of those questions for you, but I'm just suggesting how deep we have to be in our analytical meditation to start to break through, dare I say, chronically, the knots that are blocking us from even understanding karma. And dare I say, if, as Geshe Michael says, the very capacity to enable karma to ripen quickly comes from understanding it really, really well, if we want to be able to affect our world with the 4 steps and plant a very powerful karmic seed, understanding the emptiness of the karmic seed itself would come from a meditation like this. And I pray I haven't messed it up. I feel really inadequate in these kinds of things. But I'm just trying to pass on the reading that I've done, the struggling I've done with the text itself. And someday I hope be able to share the text with you. So I will read to you in full Tenzo Kappa's response to that problem about the cooked porridge. That's always what sticks in my head. So first he says, and so he refers to a phrase in the Abhidharma Kosha also about the 3 who entered the womb, the 2 of a wheel emperor and the self-emerging, I assume the next word was supposed to be Buddha. And so you can't have a wheel emperor, you can't have a wheel-turning emperor in the womb. It's a baby, but it's a baby who will turn into the wheel-turning emperor, so you can use the appellation, you can use the mere label. And so that phrase is used to explain the womb enterers to be the ones who entered the womb as a cause for becoming the wheel emperor, and so on. In the same way, when considering the consciousness that will emerge, we accept as a convention the phrase, the potential for consciousness, i.e. the karmic potential for consciousness. So Jetsu Kappa says, in many instances where a middle way person refutes that a sprout could grow through its own defining characteristics, it is said that, at the time of the seed, there is no sprout, but if it were ever to begin, then the horns of a rabbit and so on, i.e. non-existent things, would also start to grow. So that's, I want to say, the strong version of inherently existent causes. At the time of a seed, there's no sprout. It's a locked seed. But if anything were ever to sprout out of that seed, then anything at all, like the horns of a rabbit, could also grow. And that's a middle way argument for why nothing can really grow from something else. I'm actually looking at the Tibetan here because we had the discussion about the word Pemba, as in catapults you to a conclusion. This is exactly the place where I always remember it coming up. So the next sentence is, now the point that catapults us into this ridiculous consequence is, it happens that the Tibetan word for this is pen. Hachang Telwa Bembe Ne Ni, the point that catapults us into the Hachang Telwa, which is the absurd concept. Hachang is the Tibetan word for like 하청타와 extreme consequence. 하청타와 뱀뱀내니. Now the point that catapults us into this ridiculous consequence, i.e. that if a sprout could ever begin, then so could the horns of a rabbit. If a sprout that exists through its own defining characteristics does not exist at one instant, then it must never exist at all. This is true by means of the reason that if a basis is not established, then its distinguishing feature will turn out to be non-existent too. And this has to do with, again, another complex argument about, you can say, well, is it the potential of consciousness? Is the potential a distinguishing feature of consciousness? Or is it the consciousness of the potential? Is the consciousness the distinguishing feature? Like the way we put words together. We're doing it all the time. Yeah.
You're using potential. I'm assuming there's a Tibetan word that you
Nuba. Nuba, which, as I say, means the capacity to do something.
And that's separate from the English word potential as applied to emptiness.
Yes, totally. Totally different. Sorry. Yeah, because you don't ever see emptiness referred to as a potential in Tibetan. That's a way that Geshe-Michael has talked about it in order to make it accessible to us. But you just won't see Nuba applied to an absence. So Nuba is applied to karma as a positive thing, as a thing that has...
Nuba as a characteristic inherent to the seed in this
so no, obviously let's leave the word inherent out of it, because a Nuba can function if it's merely labeled. So Nuba is just the ordinary Tibetan word for can do. I can cook the rice and porridge.
The function, the function of the functioning thing.
Yeah, sorry, no, it's actually simpler than that. The word Nuba is an alternative word to Bacchak. They're used virtually synonymously in this context. I honestly, because I try to look for these things, tried to figure out if there was a difference as to when they use Bacchak and when they use Nuba. I had one of my teachers at Domaling spoke extensively about Nuba when he was explaining karma to me. He pronounced it quite differently, but I finally figured out that was the word he was using. And he said it was Bacchak and Nuba, and that was when I finally figured out what the word was. But, so again, he was putting them together. The power, here I'd say the power of the tendency, the potency of the tendency, the potential of the tendency, all of those as synonymous. The capacity of the like in physics, the capacity to do work, that's what Nuba means. It's the capacity to do work. And so it's the capacity of the tendency to bring about its result. But if you then try to see that capacity as having a nature of its own, that's where the problems arise. So I better finish this before we get completely just lost in what's already confusing. So the point that catapults us into this ridiculous consequence, i.e. that if a seed could start to sprout, then so could the horns of a rabbit. The point that catapults us into this ridiculous consequence is this. If a sprout that exists through its own defining characteristics does not exist at one instant, then it must never exist at all. That's that old thing about if it's real, then it must exist all the time. This is true by means of the reason that if a basis is not established, then its distinguishing feature, and this is what I was saying about the relationship between potential and consciousness, will turn out to be non-existent too. But in general, and I'm so grateful to Jitsa Papa for saying but in general, Chitang, to say that if at the time of the seed there is no sprout, then if it were ever to begin, it would follow that the horns of a rabbit and so on can grow is no refutation at all. The cooked rice, and now this is Jitsa Papa making us feel better. The cooked rice and so on can be explained with this reasoning too, because insofar as it must be an arising with its own nature, then cooked rice and the rest could never exist at all as something still coming into being. On the other hand, in reliance upon a consciousness coming into being that does exist, one can posit its potential. So in relationship to the consciousness that we observe as coming into being, you can posit in a merely labeled way the fact that it must have had a potential. But you will never find that potential, and that's part of this really subtle meditation we have to work on, is if you try to find a karmic potential, even in a mind-only sense, it's something that can never be focused on directly. Because it's in the foundation consciousness, you can't actually look at foundation consciousness. You only deduce it. If by saying consciousness emerges from a potential, you posit consciousness in reliance on a potential, you establish independence upon a mutually interdependent meaning. If you say, I accept that, if you get excited and say, yeah, that works for me, then indeed it is in this way that all the holy masters of great knowledge have expressed the very fact of consciousness not being established through a nature of its own. I'll say that more slowly. The cooked rice and so on can be explained with this reasoning too, because insofar as it must be an arising with its own nature, then cooked rice and the rest could never exist at all as something still coming into being. On the other hand, in reliance upon a consciousness coming into being that does exist, one can posit its potential. If by saying consciousness emerges from a potential, you posit consciousness in reliance upon a potential, you can establish it in dependence upon a mutually interdependent meaning. So if you merely set forth the moment of consciousness in reliance upon the potential, you're actually establishing an interdependent meaning. And now we're in the middle way. Because if you recognize that you can't posit the potential without the consciousness that has come into being, and you can't posit the consciousness without positing the potential, then you have a mutual interdependence, and this itself is the middle way, to quote Arya Nagarjuna. And so Chetakapa, I'd have to look for the Tibetan now, but it was so clear. He says, if you say, I accept that, then indeed, it is in this way that all the holy masters of great knowledge have expressed the very fact of consciousness not being established through its own. Because that mutual interdependence is precisely what proves dependent origination and therefore emptiness. As it says in the commentary, this is a Sanga's commentary, everything that is established in reliance, like long and short, far and near, becomes something that exists nominally. The existence has no nature of its own. For these things, it is not a general refutation of existence. But you should understand that all distinctions regarding a refutation of all these distinctions regarding a refutation of existence through a nature of its own. So you always have to, in your mind, add that distinction of the thing to be refuted. And this may be, among Tibetan lineages, the thing that makes Tsongkhapa he's most famous for, almost. I'm not saying it's what he should be most famous for. That's an open question. But among non-Gelugpas, they think of this as being the key thing that Tsongkhapa added. And whether they agree with that or not is a whole other story. But the fact that he didn't want to say things don't exist. Or, yeah. There's this famous phrase in the Nyingma and Dzogchen traditions of me shindu nangma, appearing even though it doesn't exist. And in the end, they may mean the same thing, but Tsongkhapa would never say that. He's always saying, Rangiteni ki drupa mayimbe shindu nangma. It appears even though it's not, it doesn't exist or any characteristics of its own, or as Geshe-Michael would add, because it doesn't have any characteristics of its own, therefore it can appear. And this is an example, I think, where he's very clearly saying it's because it doesn't have that nature that it appears. He says, if you say it like this, then it will be something that concords with what we ourselves say. It's so lovely when Tsongkhapa explicitly tells us what concords with our own view. I think it's time to take a break. Are we getting wiped out now? So just to wrap up this argument, he also talks about the causal stream, and you get that picture of a mind-only school. The very mind stream would be a billiard ball, series of billiard balls of moments of consciousness that have their own nature. And he says, middle way position says, if each part of the causal stream were substantially distinct, then logically they would have to be as completely separate as two different people, such as Maitreya and Upagupta. So then my mind stream this morning and my mind stream yesterday, if they're real, would have to be as distinct as my mind stream and your mind stream. But then there's no place at which to collect them all into a stream that could be really one. So it's like either you make the moments real, and then you can never have a real stream. But if you make the stream real, then it's a whole bunch of other problems. But again, Swaminatha points out that this argument is only made up to refute what was wrong in the opponent's position. It does not follow through to a mere other. And this word mere is so wonderful because it says, yeah, sure, you're different than I am. No problem. But then go back to where we were meditating today and realize that because that's a mere other, it's an other that can be overcome. It's an other that can be surpassed at another layer of thought, at another layer of conception, or another layer of non-conception. See? It's a real other, then this morning's meditation doesn't make sense. But if it's an other that is established at a certain layer of valid perceptions, then one can go deeper and deeper, or higher and higher, however you want to think of it, to other perspectives to different perspectives, I won't use the word other again, to different perspectives where that self and other doesn't make sense in the same way. So I'll just give you the encapsulation to that, which is, when even karmic potentials are realized to be empty of inherent nature, then the energetic potency that they offer might be transformed quite dramatically into infinite potential. So this is, if we go deeply into the emptiness of the seeds themselves, and think of them, it's lovely sometimes to use these different words. The seed analogy, the fragrance analogy, the making pots putting together analogy, the traces analogy, and here, the potential analogy, literally. Karma's an energy, and by habit, it will turn into the thing it was supposed to turn into. But as I've heard Geshe Michael say many times, through dedication, you can even change what certain seeds are going to turn into. You can take the energy that was there in how you serve sick people, but if what you really need now is wealth, you can actually shift that because it's still virtue, and it's still goodness, and it's still serving others. And so that potential's there. And we have so many scientific images for raw energy and raw potential and so on. For when the mind understands that the karmic seeds and tendencies never had any necessary identity in the first place, the active creation of new images and new causes in time C+1 can go back and apply to C B-2. You know what I'm saying? It's just like the whole chain being empty can be retroactive. There are things we can do in the present that will change the potential planted in the past and how they will give their result in the future. So for when the mind understands that the karmic seeds and tendencies never had any necessary identity in the first place, the active creation of new images and new causes can take up and integrate the old energies while gradually transforming their former content. And I will plant the seed for many of you. Herein lies the crux of the tantric alchemical engine. But if karmic potentials bore inherent characteristics, they could never give rise to anything but their inherent fruit and could never be transmuted. But, for example, in Jigsaw Kappa's Goisamajik commentaries, he gives extensive teaching on how each part of the sadhana practice is symbolically correlated to something in our ordinary existence. That by meditating for thousands and thousands of hours on this pure version, for example, of being born, or a pure version of having an environment, or a pure version of the destruction of an entire world system, as we glimpsed yesterday in a very sutra-style meditation. You could take the meditation we did yesterday on everything turning into decay and finally being destroyed by fire, correlate that to an emptiness meditation, and end up seeing it as the purification of the universe. Because of the mere labeling of the seeds that are so deeply imprinted in us, you can shift the seed just a little bit, and the way you rethink it will completely change how it ripens. And I'll add that just in really practical terms. I find this to be just helpful in daily life. When you notice an affliction, you notice a problem, and you're not yet at the point where you can resolve the whole thing, you look at the person, for example, the person who's causing you difficulty, and you say, well, if I just changed the label this much, would it help? And then you start getting used to that. And then you say, well, if I just changed the label this much, would it help? And suddenly you're retelling the story of how that person is affecting you. And what's so cool is then they actually start acting differently. So, and this was an important point I wanted to add to what I was saying yesterday about, yes, we do have our own karmic streams. But what's so bizarre about the interconnectedness of our karmic streams is that as our karma changes, the beings whose karma we encounter do change. And somebody asked me about this yesterday, so I wanted to bring it up to the whole group. That I remember again in an ACI course, Geshe was answering a question about, well, why would my own karma lead somebody else to do the very thing to me that my karma was right for? And he said it's cosmic justice. That was all he would say, cosmic justice. But for me, as a practitioner, I've needed to think about this really, really carefully. And we're not going to be able to see it directly until we're Buddhas, because karma is deeply hidden. But if one starts to do more and more of that meditation on the interconnectedness of our pranas, the interconnectedness of our world orbits, shall we say, I think the magnet analogy can help. Like, everybody has this fluid constellation of karmic potentialities which need many causes and conditions in order to ripen. You see what I was saying before about it's not just a single computer program that's always going to ripen in one way. Our minds themselves are producing causes and conditions all the time that will make one or another karma ripen before, earlier or later. And then there's this inexplicable, bizarre, and marvelous interaction of one person's karmic stream and my karmic stream, and the fact that every single one of us is connected from time without beginning. And somehow, when a certain energy is coming to fruition, surface, reaching its ripening point for us, like a magnet, we will attract to us the people and situations that will be the accurate reflection of that karma for us, without in the least bit denying or diminishing the fact that it was the right thing to arise for that person in their constellation of karma at that moment. But none of it is deterministic, because of the fact, both, as I think we were talking about, that space, the more space you gain in your mind through shamatha practices and understanding emptiness, you're dealing with this non-inherently existent pool of karmic potentiality in every given moment. And it's not fixed what's going to ripen that day. And so how we're practicing will change the way the dance of that bubbling sea of potentiality comes to fruition. But it also, the way we actually interact with the, I would say, the raw energy of others has infinite potential, because their seeds are merely labeled also. And having a conversation with somebody, just the simple act of having that Starbucks conversation, when your hearts are open, you can shift each other's karma. And so that, I just want to offer this as more and more complex, but also maybe simpler ways of thinking of why these things work and how our hearts are affecting each other. And the less we think of it as a programmed mathematical formula, and more as the labeling process of a pool of infinite potential, the more exponential, to go back to mathematical analogy, the results can become. Does that help a little bit? So let's leave it there. I'll come back at 12:15.
Thank you.